Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. We are in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Now this is going to be an interesting chapter because if you remember Samuel's first failure back in chapter 13, it revealed his heart. Not that God need reasons to justify his actions, but Saul, as we are moving out, is turning out to be a bad person, a foolish person. We saw in chapter 14 his foolish command for his soldiers. So in other words, but they're going to continue to get worse and worse and worse. In this chapter here, so if there was a chance, a second chance for Saul, he is going to blow it big time, thus proving why God doesn't like him as a character. Okay? And again, as we move on, we're going to see this becomes the difference between David and Saul. David will commit a heinous sin, and we'll get to that in his life. But David's heart was always right before God. Saul is progressing in his heinousness, but it is his heart that is worse than anything else. Okay, so let's get to it. First Samuel chapter 15 and then 1 says, Samuel told Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you as king over his people Israel. Now listen to the words of the Lord. Now why does Samuel emphasize this? Okay, Samuel emphasized this because Saul needed to hear this. He won't listen, but he needed to hear this. Now verse 2 says, this is what the Lord of hosts says. I witnessed what the Amalekites did to the Israelites when they opposed them along the way as they were coming out of Egypt. Now go and attack the Amalekites and completely destroy everything they have. Do not spare them. Kill men and women, children and infants, ox and sheep, camels and donkeys. Now, we will come back to the last phrase, the animals. But what is troubling to some people is this very stern command to annihilate everyone, including infants. And some people have a very strong moral conflict. In other words, how could God be loving and at the same time do this? And I made the statement earlier, not that God, not that God needs justification. And just as a matter of fact, God does not justify his actions, period. He doesn't. As we read, we do get some knowledge and information. And when it comes to this issue of how God is justified in ordering the annihilation of an entire village or people, including children, and then notice this, children and infants, right? First of all, that's it. God does not justify himself. And I'll say this, the only reason why you can try to indict God is based upon what God has given us in terms of good and bad, good and evil, right and wrong, right? But remember, God is God, and God can do with his creation as he pleases, and that really is kind of the way to look at this. There's a lot of layers here. In other words, God doesn't look at death the way we look at it. For example, I remember my first wife passed away. My young children, I had 4 children, they were young. And I remember, and I'm going to say pray kind of a standard emotional prayer. God, but my children need their mother. And I'm praying that as if God doesn't know that, right? The reality is that, no, God probably like, no, they didn't, because they did go on in life without their mother. Secondly, death to God. What is death to God? See? So remember, death to God is just leaving one realm for the other. In other words, remember, from God's perspective, humans are eternal, using the phrase here, meaning we don't stop existing. We don't stop existing. Okay? So humans are eternal. So it would be like if I said, and I know this is not doing it justice, but like if I say, and I'm pointing this way because that's the direction of some other rooms in my house. And let's say if I can find one of my children to one of those rooms. Now they exist in that room. But I'm master of the whole house. So if I say I'm kicking you out of that room and putting you in another room, right? I'm just transferring one location. Death is just a transfer of location. I'm not minimizing death. I'm not minimizing the painfulness of death. But understand, from God's perspective, my first wife has been with the Lord now for over 30 years, right? She is with the Lord for over 30 years. So when we look at this kind of scenario here, when God commands that, remember, from God's perspective, it's a little different. Okay, and I'm emphasizing the children and the infants. So if you want to look at this from this, like the execution, I'm going over in my mind here how what I'm getting ready to say could be even worse, but from God's perspective, remember, could he be sparing those infants, those children and infants, as they grow up? You have to remember the Amalekites, all the surrounding nations were extremely wicked and evil. Some of those children and infants, in their pagan worship, they offered to the god, the Moloch god, in the fire. This execution could be sparing them from a lot of pain. And again, I'm acknowledging that, people may say, wow, what, and I would kind of respond to that. My purpose is simply to say that, in other words, my purpose is simply to say, from God's perspective, if you kind of look at existence from God's perspective, the nations around Israel were extremely wicked, extremely wicked, extremely sinful and evil and violent. Okay? So my point here is to simply say that from God's perspective, when we deal with these kinds of situations right here, and this is one that people have an issue with. This is one where people will say, man, what's up with God in this? How can God be loving? Because see, remember, we narrow God to just our physical existence and not really understanding the eternal presence of God. Okay? Now, God doesn't justify this. I was in an exchange with some people who were trying to raise this very thing. And as always, when we raise this, when we say, well, okay, what is the difference in God ordering the murder, the annihilation, the slaughter of, now get this, women and children, versus when someone takes it upon themselves to carry out. Now, we just had it in the news at the time of this recording, the Texas massacre, slaughter, right? Where a person goes into a school and 20 people are dead from a mass shooter. So what's the difference between that person and God? Right? So was that person right to do that? The answer is absolutely not. One, that person is not God. So let me have to step back. So let's look at, again, God again. So first and foremost, and I'm going a totally different direction, of course, with this study, but I think it is important because when we see this phrase here in verse 3, kill every one of them, including the children and infants, right? So that is going to be the most objectionable. But let's start with God as God. Let's start with God as the creator over his own creation. So you have to start with that. Does it help in our understanding? No, it doesn't. But let's start with that. So if you see in the screen here, that bag right there, it's just been sitting there. I've just been too lazy to move it. But that's a Apple bag. Okay. Don't I have as sovereign over my home here? This is my little area that I do these tapings and stuff. It's like an office here. Don't I have sovereignty over this? That bag is sat there because, as I told you, I was just too lazy to move it. But suppose I wanted to sit here. I could say this bag can sit here because I wanted to sit. I want that bag to sit there. If I choose to take that bag, which I own, I paid for it, so it's mine, and rip it up, is it not my bag to do with as I please? Now I say that because my wife probably would say, oh, please give me the bag. She loves bags. Okay, good bags. Okay. But my point is, that's mine to do with what I please. Right? It's mine. Now let's go back, because remember I talked about how God's withdrawing his mercy from Saul. We're going to see this later on. God rejects Saul. Why? Because God can do as he pleases with his creation. So you start with that. God is sovereign over creation. He created everything. He created everything. So God is sovereign over everything. And as sovereign over everything, he can choose to do what he wants. Now, guess what? I'm not going to explain this bag if I remove it, if I shred it, if I rip it up. It is mine to do with what I choose to do with it. God's creation is what he chose. So when God flooded the earth during Noah's time, God was sovereign to do that. Man does not have rights. And that's the interesting thing. Man does not have rights. Okay. I'm going to come out of this because I know I'm not going to finish this now. But man does not have rights. And I mean, so I can see it big anyway. Man doesn't have rights, does he? God is sovereign. For example, if God allows the timeline of the earth, man on this earth, for another 50 years, that is God's sovereign right to do so. God could say, you know what? Man's time on this earth will end tomorrow, next week, next month. That's God's sovereignty to do that. However God's sovereignty is, he can do that. So, when God uses Job and says, you know what? He allowed Satan to destroy Job's life. People say, well, that's fair. Fair from what perspective? So the question would be, how can you charge God with wrongdoing? And let me just say this. Those who do so outside of the presence of God, okay? And as I told one person, you don't have enough information because God did not give you enough information. But we do have a revelation in terms of God is, from God's perspective, he can do as he pleased with his creation. Now, there are a lot of things that are involved in that God sovereignly chooses. So like in the case of Job, he allows Satan to destroy his life, but then he gave Job double. So in the case of the infants, the children in infants, that he ordered the execution, right? He ordered the execution. Think about them now in the presence of God. Okay, so now as we come back to the earth, right? It's God just in doing that. And as I will say, God can do as he pleased. That's the thing. You can throw your middle finger at him, you can wag your finger at him, and in the end, God is still God. And he can do whatever he pleases. And that's the point I want to say with this. It's foolish to try to justify God when God himself does not justify. In other words, he doesn't say, hey, as he instructs Saul, I want you to annihilate everyone, all the Amalekites, including the children and infants. But here's why I'm doing this. Let me explain to you why I'm doing this. You know, he doesn't do that. You go back and you read Job, he doesn't explain to Job why he allows Satan to destroy his life. I'm God. In fact, that is his, when you get to Job, you find that is his explanation. Job, where were you when I created the stars, the moon, when I laid the foundation of the earth, etc., etc., etc.? Basically, I'm God. Next question. So, even though I could say that these were wicked people, when we get to the women and infants, you say, "Wow!" But the children and infants, were they wicked? Were they wicked before God? And I'm going to tell you, God's sovereignty overrules all. That's where we're going to leave it at. All right, I want to pick back up with this in the next study, because like I say, there's some, in a lot of respects, I will never be able to answer that answer that question fully to everyone's satisfaction. That's why I say we start and finish with God's sovereignty. All right, guys, we'll pick it up in part 2 of the study in 1 Samuel chapter 15. See you then.